Hi, thanks for sticking around. Trapped you in with the first one, now you're stuck, right? So,
No, we're not.
so my name's Jim Brinson. I'm actually a faculty member at the American Public University System. I've been involved with what I would call alternative types of science education for over a decade now. I kind of got in with all of it probably around 2004 when I really started, and then I've been following the trends all the way up until now. And what I want to talk about a little bit is thinking differently about some of our educational policy, especially when it comes to science education. I started my career, right now I teach biochemistry and genetics at the university, and when I actually first started there, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today, give you an example, general chemistry for all kinds of science majors. And how do I do that? How do we do that at our institution? How do we take something that seems so location specific when it comes to education and essentially disseminate that all over the world? A lot of people in my field, you know, when I speak at professional conferences and in my discipline and things like that, they, of course, immediately I'm met with resistance. This can't happen. We can't do it this way. This encroaches upon all the hallowed halls of what science is. So, I started my career actually as a high school science teacher a long time ago. My wife is currently a public school teacher as well in the sciences. So when it comes to science teacher preparation, when I look to the future, I don't think just about science and technology innovation itself. I don't think about that in a vacuum. I think a lot about how we are, in order to prepare students to be successful, we're also going to have to prepare those people that are going to enable them to learn that content and to be successful if we're going to have any hope of changing the way things are. So how can we meet a big problem right now with teacher shortage all over the country, in all the states, but particularly in STEM fields? How do we address this issue? How can we think differently about it? And what can we do practically to sort of start to mitigate some of that shortfall? So if you look at some of the problems and current trends going on, according to the National Center of Education Statistics on the most recent sort of dive that they did, you're looking at the school-going population to increase by about 3 million students in the next decade. And that's sort of 3 million above. You know, it's been pretty plateaued and stagnant for a while in terms of how many people are in the school system at any given time. Obviously, population continues to increase, but for whatever reason, in the next decade, this is the growth that we're expecting to see. That requires, above and beyond normal standard hiring practices and the normal pool that we have to hire every year of educators, an additional 145,000 on top of that. So that's a big bubble that has to be met here. And that's in order to reduce these people to teacher ratios from currently about 16 to 1 on average, all the way back down to our pre-recession ratios of about 15 to 1. It doesn't sound like much of a difference, but it's a huge difference when you look at the overall numbers here. So between 09 and 14, however, we also noticed about a 35% drop in enrollment in teacher preparation programs. One of the other things that I do, I also teach graduate courses for science teacher prep programs. I've noticed it myself for sure, definitely at the graduate level. One of the things that I used to do was in Indiana we have a transition to teaching program. Similar programs exist everywhere, I think, but this is where people in the STEM fields who were not trained in pedagogical and classroom techniques, where they could take their science content and then transfer that back in and learn the educational psychology, learn the pedagogy, learn the andragogy, and the things associated with taking that and delivering that in a way in a classroom, because that's very different than just knowing the content, as we all know. I loved teaching for that program. It was great, but that honestly, I went from about 10 grad students that first year down to, well, now the program ceases to exist. So I witnessed this personally, not just within the numbers that you see there. In this 2017-2018 school year, 43 states and the District of Columbia reported shortages in science specifically. And if you know anybody involved with public school, you know this to be true. Teachers are being hired a lot as emergency hires. They are sometimes not even qualified. Sometimes they don't even have a background in science, but they're put into a science classroom because they're willing. This is obviously a bad idea. But rather than trying to hit that shortfall trying to accommodate that by just putting bodies in the classroom and trying to fix that, you're creating a bigger problem in the end, because what you end up with is a high turnover rate, a huge attrition rate for these people, especially in programs that are coming through that don't have the proper classroom preparation besides the science content. So you're seeing a lot of students leave very early out of those programs, or in the case of the way that we've changed majors now, the way that licensing and certification works, pretty much now, it used to be whenever I was going through as an undergrad, you would actually have a science education major. So your major then was, you'd have your majority hours in your fields of study, but then you would have lots of science classes, lots of education classes that go with that. However, now you're actually graduating, and essentially with a double major. You're graduating in your field, biology, chemistry, physics, and then pretty much the equivalency of another major to pick up those other education classes. And that's a lot more than what it used to be. The result of that is when people are graduating with fields, with STEM degrees, they're not wanting to take a $30,000 teaching job whenever they can get a lot more, double that at least, with a STEM job right out of the gate. So that's one of the things that's really hurt the science teaching preparation field. Particularly, I want to talk a little bit about what can we do about this and some of the things that we are doing and that I've been involved with to help address some of the shortfall. There are a lot of potentially great science teachers in general, but particularly science teachers out there, if we can get them to a program. If we can create opportunities, educational opportunities for them to access that otherwise they may not have access to. Our demographics, for example. The majority of our students are military students that are deployed all over the world. But that's not a lot different than a lot of students now. The face of the average college student now is very different than the face was even 10, 15 years ago. We've got a lot higher mean age range that are taking these classes. We have a lot of people who are not your typical 16-week resident students anymore. They're taking, even at your brick and mortar institutions, they're taking a lot of these from a distance or alternative formats. The demography is different, and brick and mortar institutions have not done a great job adapting to that process. As a result, a lot of people have been limited in their educational opportunities. Our average age of our students is 33, and about 87% of them are working adults. And by that, included within that, is about 78% of our student demographic is active duty, military, guard, reserve, and veterans. So, I don't know if you've ever had military students before, but they're some of the best students that are imaginable. And I look at so many of them and think, they would be a great science teacher. They would be a great science teacher. They would be really, really good, and they have a passion for it, and they're good at it, and they've got so much hands-on, real-life experience from their MOS and the service that they could bring into the classroom and really use to connect with the students. But how are they going to do that? They've got kids, they've got families. When they get out of the service, they're probably going to try to tie in what their specialty was with their career and make that transition. And it's hard to come back and just go to a brick and mortar school for 4 years and still have a life and survive and be able to provide. So, on top of all of that, military learners particularly, and their spouses and their kids, because of the way the culture works, they pose very unique educational challenges on top of just where they're located. Also pedagogically, they have different needs and they have different ways of learning. Oftentimes, obviously, they're not going to be able to participate in synchronous formats. It's just not going to work. I had students in every time zone all over the world at any given time. They have responsibility schedules, accessibility issues, logistics issues, and technology issues. And as a result, they're becoming increasingly reliant on online education. We see this trend continuing more and more. So with that comes a sort of a subset of best practices that you can that guides the education of military types of students. One of the things that we are doing at APUS is we have a bachelor's degree now in natural sciences, and what I want to talk a little bit about is now this is where sort of where the policy side comes in, because when you look at the National Science Teachers Association that develops the teacher preparation standards, through which, if you're a teacher preparation program, you can submit. I'll show you the form. You submit that, and you run through that list, and you show how you've met all these standards, and you get NSTA certification for your program. Also, the American Chemical Society. And you've got these discipline-specific ways that you can sort of bolster the credibility of your program. But almost all of them in the United States, are almost very explicit in terms of the format of these classes, particularly when it comes to labs. That's the issue, right? The lecture content oftentimes can be delivered in a way where people don't have a lot of consternation about that. But when it comes to the laboratory component, there's a lot of disagreement, and there's a lot of not wanting to accept anything but traditional ways of doing things. So it's sort of been a focus of my scholarship, especially over the last 5 years, especially, to how is the efficacy of these alternative formats versus traditional types of formats. The findings are actually quite interesting. But anyway, just as a general summary, what we've sort of been able to do here with our Bachelor of Science degree in Natural Sciences, with concentrations in biology and earth science, is to fulfill all of those boxes that the NSTA requires for their approval, including all of these lab components, but the content as well. So my point of this is there is nothing in the language. There's nothing in the way that not only the sheet itself and the standards, how to fulfill those standards, but also in the sort of the rationale, the argument that they give, the defense that they have for why these are the standards. There's a separate document for that. And I've combed through all of that, and there's nothing in that either that says specifically that this is not a way to do it. Because I can check all of those boxes, and I can do the same thing in this way, so why is there not more support for it? Okay. Not only that, my research is showing that in terms of efficacy, and I just spoke about this just last month, I actually measured experimentally in a controlled setting efficacy of these different formats, showing that depending on the type of learning objective that we're talking about, we got to keep apples to apples here. Whenever you're discussing whether or not a lab is effective, you've got to base that discussion on the learning outcome and the intended learning that you want that student to achieve. For example, a few years ago I was speaking at the Ohio Department of Higher Education, asked a few of us to come in and discuss. They're having a problem with virtual labs transferring between institutions. So immediately the discussion becomes, I asked, what is the purpose of lab? If we were all practicing scientists right now, or educators in sciences right now, and I asked every one of you, what is the purpose of a lab when you teach? We're all going to give a slightly different answer. And the reason is because, depending on your experience, depending on the class that you're teaching, depending on who you are, you may perceive that to be, practical skills are the most important thing. Reinforcing my lecture content for someone else is the most important thing. Inviting inquiry is another thing. Getting students excited about science. I've heard all of these, and they're all different. So if we can't agree on the purpose of the lab, then why are we arguing under what circumstances it's efficacious and when it's not, right? So number one, we've got to figure out the learning objectives and what we're trying to do. Once we do that, then we have to keep our conversation within that context. For example, the last project I worked on, I was specifically within physics, the physical sciences. I was a specific topic, and I was specifically limiting that measurement to conceptual understanding and scientific inquiry. And what I found under those limitations was there is no significant difference in the results. Students can learn content just as well in alternative learning formats as they can in the actual lab. They can learn scientific inquiry just as well in a non-traditional format as they can a traditional format. What is our goal as high school, secondary, or lower educators in science? What is our goal? To teach them to be chemists when they graduate high school, or to teach them an appreciation and understanding of the fundamental concepts of what science is and how that process works. So other people will say to me, well, yeah, but whenever if you're not in a lab, whenever you isolate ethyl acetate, you're not going to smell bananas through the computer screen. You're absolutely right, you're not going to, but my question then becomes, are those things that you're assessing for? Are those things, are those learning objectives that you're trying to teach, or is that just like a side added benefit that you're wanting to give your student? Because when I did my undergraduate, when I had my chemistry, my Gen Chem class that I'm going to talk about here in a second, you'll see that what I did was I went through a Gen Chem sequence. I had first semester, second semester, great lab experience. I loved it. My midterm and final were written finals. I did not need to complete those labs in order to pass the assessments that were given to me. I could have done them all virtually and answered them all exactly the same, right? So there's a disconnect between why we're saying things can't be and how we're assessing and you know, the actual proof and data that we're using to say why those can't be. A lot of those are editorialized, a lot of them are sort of theoretical, but very little of them are ever empirical as to the differences and why we can't do these things. Okay, so going very quickly here, I'm not going to go make you read through all of this. If you want the slides for reference, and I can send those to you. But basically, the way that it works for the NSTA standards are there's for a general science licensure, and this can vary by state when it comes to specific licensure, but the umbrella idea here is general science is grades 5 through 12, not necessarily discipline specific. This is and in the high school, this is going to limit the types of classes you're teaching, but in junior high and middle school, this will work. You need to have 1 year of bio, 1 year of chem, 1 year of physics and physical science, right? And some astronomy and earth science in there. My point is, we have a situation, we have a setup right now where that can all be met. And I'll show you real quickly how the labs work on that and how it's not sacrificing any quality of learning and understanding and pedagogy. Okay, but the point is, those boxes are checked. I've mapped that. To get a single field licensure, grades 5 through 12, for biology or earth space science, it's already broken down. We've got all the classes, we've got all the content that set up already so that someone, when they come out of our program, it's not an education degree, they won't have licensure, right? They don't have those pedagogy classes. They can pick those up from the School of Ed, but that's not our job. And they can, what we're saying is, with these students, they can take all those science content classes that they never thought they could have taken before in order to learn science, to be able to have those now, because those education classes, because of the nature of those classes, are a little easier to find online somewhere else to put all that together. It's the science courses that are always difficult to get that content to meet certification standards. So here's how you can do it. You got to have your coursework for a major. Then you got to have a certain number of semester hours at 30 or above. The point is, we've got all of that, right? Dual field, if you want to do biology and earth space science. Criteria is a little bit different. We've got all of that. Okay, all the way up through senior research seminars and all that kind of stuff. So to the point, what about labs? Because that's the thing that people care most about. This experience, this hands-on experience in science. How can you feasibly receive a vigorous, laboratory-centered type of education in an alternative format? You can use. How do you use physical manipulatives? I'm someone who's still a little bit traditional in the sense that I believe that when it comes to objectives, and you've got to think about what it is you're trying to teach these students, you can do it in alternative formats, not just like we've always done it. But there are still things that you have to do because we don't have the technology and means to do that yet. Maybe someday. Right now, we don't. We can't just say it's all or nothing here. You've got to tease it apart is my point of what I'm trying to say. So, basically the question here in terms of policy is how can we do this and meet the standards for science content for a person who wants to be an educator. Now obviously the whole goal of all of this, and the reason I'm talking about this, is trying to fix this problem. We need more science teachers. How can we reach out? How can we think outside the box? And how can we provide that opportunity in a less limiting way to many, many more people that have heretofore haven't been able to have that because of how hard and difficult it is to come into a situation face-to-face like that to make that happen. Okay, if we look at what the research and best practice says, is for non-traditional student learning, we need to have multiple learning modalities. Okay, so in other words, especially for military students, in our case, virtual alone doesn't always work very well because of the type and the nature of the students that we have as military students. So that will work, but there also has to be some tactile stuff. There has to be multimodal things going on. I've already sort of mentioned this, but what is the purpose? Right? We got to keep that in mind. And should labs even be part of all science classes? Now that's a good way to get rode on a rail in a science conference. When I'm talking about should labs even be in some of these classes that we teach in terms of content. We'll save that for another day. I'm probably going to make enough people mad the way it is, so I don't need it. There's obviously different ways to do this. You've probably seen them before. We've got campus-based labs I've taught in situations where students would come in and we would spend an intensive, whether a day or a weekend or a week, depending on the situation. That's certainly an option. It's the most difficult option when you have students that are spread out all over the world, especially those that are adult learners who then have to worry about childcare and all that kind of stuff. You have virtual labs, which are certainly really, really good in terms of, like I said before, conceptual understanding, even teaching inquiry. They work very well for that. Maybe not so well for practical skills in the workplace, but is that the point of what you're trying to teach? You got to ask yourself that. Remote labs, the remote is different. Like for example, at our university, we have a telescope mounted, right, and that you can access anywhere in the world. Students, our space study students, can access that telescope. They can get telescope time. They can, take their images. That's remote. It's a real thing, but it's just accessed remotely. That's different than virtually, right? Kitchen labs, that's sort of the easy way about it. Just find things in your kitchen, everyday things, mix them together. Lab kits, though, take it a step farther. They kick it up a notch, and this is what I really like to do, especially when it comes to our majors. This is an experience that I've been able to actually provide that really is not a lot different than what I was able to provide when I taught on campus classes. And I'll show you what I mean without sacrificing any rigor or anything like that. So, obviously blending, this maximum results will be from blending. Find what works best, because a lot of cases, if you have some cases it shows where these non-traditional formats, even let's say strictly virtual lab. Now, when by virtual labs, I don't mean simulations, like you press play and then it all happens. I'm talking about interactive, pretty high fidelity virtual labs, where students mix things. You put too much in, it overflows. Right? You can catch things on fire. If you set the fire setting too close to something else, bad things are going to happen. So pretty good response and feedback, and those are continue to develop actually in a very impressive way. There's VR stuff out there now, right, where you can actually sort of immerse yourself virtually in the lab, which is really cool. But finding the key, finding which is best for what. Let's mix that together, right? Because if we can find that a VR experience or just a virtual 2D experience or something like that can teach this content either as well as the face-to-face things that we are doing, then that's going to save us a ton of money and give us a lot more access opportunity. Let's do it that way. If we find that we can't do it that way and there's something that in the hands-on physical works better, then do that. Let's find that. Let's not assume that there's a one solution here, but a multi-pronged solution to deliver the best and most efficient content that we can. All right, so here's an example of like a kit that we would use. It's chock full of, it's like Christmas when it comes. It's got so much stuff inside. And what we do is, it's got the chemicals and it's got green chemicals, all the stuff that you would normally have, all your PPE, and we ship worldwide, all over the world to, well, everywhere that I know of. I don't know that we have a place that we can't get stuff right now. But what I do, something different, and well, when I say I mean our department, what we do, is we use digital data acquisition. Just like we did in the lab when I was an undergrad, it was the same thing. We had a digital interface, we had probes, we had all this kind of stuff. We were on a lab bench. We had all the exact same stuff that we had right there in that picture, just in a lab bench or in a cabinet somewhere. All the same stuff, right? We had this. The only difference was, instead of having its own standalone portable unit, which is extremely useful, it was plugged in directly to a computer with a software program. Exact same output, exact same everything, right? This is more portable. Our students then, as they progress through the program, they get more of these probes. They use their LabQuest interface, and they can save all their data, which is also really good because at the end of our program, just like a lot of other programs, they have a senior research project. They pair with the faculty. They have a faculty advisor. They have to do research in the field. This is portable, so whatever sensors they've accumulated over time, that's theirs. They get to keep that. All those lab materials that are in this in this picture, they get to keep that. And by the time they're a senior, graduating this program, they have their own lab. They have their own lab at home with all the sensors and the stuff that they would have, stuff that they would need to conduct research. They're going to have all of that. The result is, when I developed General Chemistry 2 for science majors, I ended up teaching the exact same labs that I taught on campus. The exact same labs, right there, in an alternative format, right? That required me to do pre-lab lectures on video instead of face-to-face, but my students zoned out in pre-lab videos anyway, or face-to-face anyway. I don't think they heard it. It's probably better to put it on video. So when they wake up, they can rewind it. So they everything else is the same though, right? The guided procedure. And here's what's interesting too. There's two things that have come out of this that I think it may be small, but I think are worth mentioning. And that is, number one, these students who are doing this at home, their kids are getting excited about science. They're watching them, and I don't know how many times my students say to me, "My kid loved this. You know, it was awesome, and they want to do it now. Do you know where I can get something like this for a kid?" That's exactly the whole point of this call. That was the whole point of this conversation, to bring back these future educators, to bring back, and who knows what love of science you can instill, and just by watching them to see that their parents are enjoying this, and then they can start enjoying this. Science isn't scary anymore. And on top of that, they said, you know, and I know that a lot of times this results, and students are allowed to work together if they have someone close enough to them, if they want to work in pairs, but a lot of times these are students who can't do that. And the students who have to work alone have said that this requires me to know my stuff, right? I can't skate through. I've taken a lab class somewhere else before, and honestly, I didn't have to put this much work into it. And they said, thanks for that. Because how many times have we taught a lab class whenever there's a group of 2 or 3 and there's one person doing it, and the other 2 aren't getting anything from it? They're just skating, they're waiting for the data to come in. Everyone's accountable now in this situation, okay? I'm got to be done, so I'll give you the important part of the wrap up here. Here's just some pictures of how the labs can be the same, all the same sort of stuff you would do in an actual lab. One thing that you do, one concern that people often have is, what about verifying student identity, you know, academic integrity and all of that? I require pictures with their name, their ID number, the date, handwritten, not typed. I blocked out their pictures, but I see their face. Also, for the lab space, videos sometimes. If it's a reaction that I want to see, or I want to hear them say the words, or I want to have them explain it to me, they have to start the video and they pan the lab space, so 360, so I can see everything that's around them. Then they set it down. No editing of the video, raw only. I get to see them enter the field, they talk, and then I got to see them shut it off. So I can verify that it's them who's doing it, and they're the ones responsible for you know, showing me the information that I request. So there's lots of different ways that we can go through all this. And then the pictures that I require in the videos are at different benchmarks throughout the lab, like the specific results, the setup of the lab before they start, all kinds of stuff like that. To verify the products that they say they actually got. I want to see the measurement readout, that sort of stuff. That is more individual attention that I could ever provide in a lab setting when I've got 20 to 30 students in a lab and maybe one TA, and we're trying to get everything. The amount of individual attention that I'm able to give these students far exceeds anything that I've ever been able to give in the past. So in that way, it's better. All right. So there's nothing. Here's the takeaway. There's nothing in the current. I know current 2012 doesn't seem current, but that's the most current ones they have. In the current 2012 NSTA Preservice Science Standards, that language does not preclude the use of non-traditional lab environments. There's nothing in there specifically that says you can't use it. That use physical manipulatives to meet standards related to content knowledge. That's standard 1. And professional knowledge, because they have to design the content, the research, they have to present it, they have to listen to faculty research things like seminars and all that kind of stuff, so they're engaging professionally in the field as well. And non-traditional labs do not contradict the knowledge base document that they use to support those standards. So my point is, let's think outside the box a little bit. Let's realize there's more things we can do in policy. Let's open our minds a little bit and realize this is a critical issue that's going to take some creativity to help solve. Let's get this out there. Let's show, you know, let's not keep it all inside the walls in terms of science education anymore. So that's it. There's my contact info if you can get a hold of me about anything. Sorry, Kevin. I had to go fast there at the end. So. Questions? Yeah.
So I like your point that you can give a lot more individual attention in remote labs, the way you're approaching it. What about the challenges of the fact that you actually potentially therefore have to spend a lot more time out of your schedule doing that?
You're right.
Than you might have. I mean, there's again a time resource restriction here?
There is. Without doubt, it takes me longer to assess individual students, right? That again depends on when you're talking about your time and your schedule. If you're trying to do this on a typical faculty schedule, 16-week semester, office hours, all that kind of stuff. My schedule is very different than that. The way that I'm loaded in terms of my students is very different than that, right? So it's sort of a different model in a sense, but still more work. I am spending more time. But for me, it's something that I want to do, and it's something that I believe in, and it's something that I know is making a difference. And when I know that those students are coming back to me, they're getting into the schools that they want to get into, they're getting into the programs that they want to get into. So that's why I do what I do. But you're right, it's not for the faint of heart. So, or it's not for the people who don't want to spend the time doing it. So yeah.
Okay. Are you at the point of measuring the quality between the two programs? For example, traditional students through the lab, non-traditional students through the lab, grades where they may go to for their next learning, types of jobs they're getting.
So do a program level assessment kind of things, or like course by course, or?
Specifically about the lab, how are you measuring the quality between the two programs? Specifically, is it students' assessment of the two different programs? Do you use grades? Do you use once they go to the next graduate program? And do you use the type of jobs they land as a long-term?
Yeah, all of the above.
Okay.
All of the above. We look at individual courses. We look at scores on standardized sorts of types of testing. Say, like, for example, let's take the ACS exam, right? American Chemical Society exam. You can look when we look at job placement. The little bit different here is a lot of times our students are already working somewhere where they're going to then sort of transition into that once this stuff is sort of complete. Now for the teacher education stuff, we haven't had any problems at all with any of the people who have taken these classes for science content for teacher certification. That's never been an issue. Everyone has been able to do what they need to do to get into those other programs. Typically what they will do is take the content with us. They'll either graduate and then go into a teacher prep program and finish whatever classes they have left, or they'll just take classes only with us and be involved with another program. But yeah, you have to use multi-ways to evaluate that. Student satisfaction. And to me, the most important metric there is employer satisfaction. Just ask. Whenever you're done, and you ask, how is this person doing? And they say, and everyone, 90% of the employers are saying, this is working out great. Then that speaks more volume to me than any sort of quantifiable metric, from that I'm doing somewhere else. So, yeah.
So you mentioned a little bit about virtual reality in terms of being able to have labs for students who are mobile or not in the traditional format. Given that you also talked about the home kits that are sent to students, I'm curious about the mix or sort of when a virtual reality may be appropriate for disseminating that as opposed to the other ways you're looking.
Yeah, so I don't know because we don't send out and we don't use any VR.
Okay.
So it's hard for me to answer that, but the question is the big question there is what you're asking about VR applies to what we could say the same thing about when is it appropriate to use kits versus virtual versus VR versus all those things, and that's what we have to start teasing out that no one seems to be doing. Everyone's supposed to be in these camps about what can and can't be done, or else when you search the first paper I wrote on this was basically just a lit review, and it was massive. I was going to do it for myself, and I was just looking, and a year and a half later, I've got a paper, and I was like, I shouldn't have had to spend a year and a half trying to find this information. Someone else needs access to this. So I published that, and then what I found very quickly is we haven't teased that out. There's a spectrum there about when and under what circumstances. It's not a spectrum, it's more of a web. Where on that, three-dimensionally even, where on that is maximum return, in terms of this method, and this method, and it's coming at it three-dimensionally, and it's so hard we just don't have the data to be able to answer that question. But I would love to find out, for example, design the perfect laboratory experience where you use VR for everything that it's the best suited to do, not just because you can, but because it showed that those learning gains are best achieved that way. Then I would use virtual, even 2D virtual, saying that these learning gains can be achieved maximally through this, kit is required maximally for these learning games. Let's put it all together in this amazing package. I would love to be able to do that, but we're so far from that right now.
Okay.
That's kind of the goal that keeps me going now. And that's my next project. I try to answer those questions. I try to find that location as we go. I made baby steps, but we need more people working on it. So.
Is there any data on those who graduate, enter into careers within the military?
So, what do you mean? I mean, yeah, we have a lot of students. We have a lot of students who graduate with the degree and who are not doing the teacher prep necessarily, but actually in the natural sciences degree, who end up working for EPA and Fish and Wildlife, Department of Forestry. We have a lot of those students. Yeah.
Okay.
And typically those are already set up because they're working there while they're working on this degree because they got into that somehow with their military connections, and now they need the degree to advance within that. So for them, we get a lot of research projects that are co-sponsored by other people who are working in those organizations, and they have some access that a lot of normal people wouldn't have to technologies and data sets and that sort of thing. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, I just wasn't sure if they stayed within any of the
Some of them, yeah.
systems commands or
Yeah,
if they,
some of them do, and not all of them. I mean, it's just like everywhere else. More of ours do than normal, but yeah.
but that's not a, I guess, strategy.
Oh, is that like one of the things that's driving us to push them? Absolutely not.
Okay.
No. Anybody else? No. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. So.